afternoon, folks. Everyone's here for the media panel, right? Okay, good. I'm Jackie Clement. I run the Fair Media Council, which is a nonprofit organization. We advocate for quality news, and we work to create a media-savvy society. Technically, we're one of the oldest and most successful media watchdog organizations in the country also. We're based here on Long Island. So I have the fun job of moderating these folks for you today. And I think to kick off, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves as well as explain to you a little bit about the media outlet that they represent and a little bit of the demographics so that if people were to pitch you, you tell them, what communities you're actually in geographically. And then what I'm going to do is ask you folks a question, which is why you came to this panel and what do you want to know? Fair enough? Okay. All right. Steve, you want to kick off?
Sure. I'm Steve Blank. I'm the editor-publisher of Blank Slate Media. So we are 6 community newspapers in Northwest Nassau County, including Great Neck, Roslyn, Manhasset, Port Washington, New Hyde Park, and Willistons. We also are our website, The Island Now, which I'm known on this as. And we're also, and this is probably shared with other newspapers, we're now, in addition to websites now, we are doing events. We're hosting community forums. We've gone into the business of doing reputational events. So that's an important element of what's going forward in terms of news organizations in order to leverage themselves and keep in business from a financial point of view. In terms of what we do, my goal has always been from a newspaper is to be a daily newspaper that publishes once a week in terms of quality and the depth of coverage in the communities we cover. So we operate pretty much along the lines of a traditional newspaper. The only difference is that with our website, we moved to WordPress, and now we're actually web first. So any of the stories that you see on our in our newspaper will first appear in our newspaper.
Hi everybody, I'm Cecilia Dowd. Up until 3 weeks ago, I was a reporter for FiOS One, which shuttered. I would cover crime, politics, anything. I would go out every day and turn several stories. I do have a new job. I'm starting next week. I'm not ready to announce it yet because I fear it's a little bit unprofessional, but I'll be doing more of the same on Long Island. My audience has always been and will be Long Islanders, anywhere from the East End to Western Nassau County. And it will be more of the same. I mean, I've covered everything from environmental issues to high-profile trials to politics, debates, etc. And I'll be doing more of that. And as for demographics and who watches and whatnot, I can just tell you, and this is pure speculation because we were never really given numbers at FiOS, but younger people, probably 20s, 30s, maybe low 40s, tend to get a lot of their news online, while a bit older than that tend to be a little bit more old school, for lack of a better word, and actually watch the news live. And it's not to say that they're not watching the same thing. They may watch my FiOS stories that aired on TV, but just an hour or two later via the website.
Scott.
Yeah, I'm Scott Britton. I'm executive editor of Herald Newspapers, Herald Community Newspapers. So we have 18 newspapers on the north and south shores of Nassau County. We cover 26 different communities, 5 of them on the North Shore, the rest on the South Shore. Our coverage area extends from Belmore in the east all the way to Valley Stream, the Queens border in the west. And on the North Shore we cover Seacliff, Glen Head, Glen Cove, Oaks Valley, Oyster Bay, that sort of thing. I'm also a professor at Hofstra University. That's all. And I'm press club president. In case you're interested in the press club Long Island, I'd be happy to talk to you about that.
I'm Pam Robinson. I'm the editor and publisher of Huntington Now, which is a digital-only site covering Huntington. We're about a year and a half old. One of my first advisors was Jackie, so she knows a lot about my business, I think. We cover primarily downtown Huntington and South Huntington / Huntington Station. We do make a major effort to cover the Latino community in Huntington Station in a way that isn't only about crime, to talk about the people there who are creating businesses and a lot of other things. Our demographics on our site are pretty interesting. It tends to be, I just looked at our analytics yesterday, it tends to be women aged about 30 to 45. Women outnumber the men by a fairly large number, and the readers are coming from Huntington Station, Huntington, and then lesser amount in Dix Hills, Northport, Cold Spring Harbor, things like that. We cover, as I said, primarily downtown Huntington and Huntington Station, but we dip into the other areas, but it's almost too much. You know, there's 8 fire departments, 8 school districts, you know, numerous village mayors and other kinds of government, all kinds of other little organizations within there. So when you add in town board, planning board, zoning board, whatever else is going on in town, that pretty much grabs you. We do get a lot of readership of government news. It's kind of surprising, not what you would have thought ordinarily, but people do want to know, particularly about zoning. If you're familiar with Huntington, you're aware of this Matinacock housing that just went through last week, and that has gotten a certain number of people riled up, a certain number of people thrilled that it succeeded. So zoning, demographic issues in Huntington are all very, very important. And there is no shortage of news in Huntington. My biggest issue is trying to make some money so I can hire someone else to give me a hand.
And JT, who will more than happily explain Newsday and his role there. Yes.
So my name is James Medora. I write about the economy for Newsday. So that means I write about the Long Island economy, I write about development, and I write about the connections between government and business. Because in a previous life, I was Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. And I had the pleasure of covering 2 governors that we all want to forget about. David Alexander Patterson and Elliott Lawrence Spitzer. We have term limits for Albany Bureau Chief, so when Andrew Mark Cuomo became governor of the state of New York, we got a new bureau chief. Yes, I know the middle names of every governor because there's not very much to do in Albany, and there's a drinking game that revolves around the middle names of governors. So I worked for Newsday for more than 20 years. And most of you think of us as this, right? As we affectionately call it, the dead tree. And the dead tree edition continues to pay the bills at Newsday. But we obviously have other platforms, whether it be your phone, whether it be your iPad. You may know that we recently moved into a new headquarters, and one of the reasons we did is because we're launching a television venture. And we do a lot of events. One of our new experiments that actually worked out much better than we thought it would was we streamed live on election night election results for Long Island. We did not think anyone would watch. We thought that was a News 12 thing and not a Newsday thing, but actually people did watch. So we're learning how to use new platforms, and our focus is we want you to get news from Newsday on the platform you want to use. So if you want to buy the dead tree, God bless you. But if you want to read on your phone, that's perfectly fine too. Our audience is 1.5 million people. That's half of Long Island's population. And I tell people this all the time. We're about one thing. And we've been about one thing since 1940 when we were founded by Alicia Patterson. We're the largest newspaper in America to have been founded by a woman. And she was all about Long Island, and we're all about Long Island. So if it's about Long Island, we care. If you're pitching us a story about Queens, Queens and Brooklyn are dead to us. They really are. You know, we look at Long Island in a political sense, not the geographic sense. And we have about 350 people in the newsroom. We can talk later on about how you navigate that. It's a little tough to figure out who to call at Newsday, and we can talk about that and how to connect with Newsday, but we're very interested in all news on Long Island.
Okay, so as you can see, we have a range of experience as well as geographical areas that you can contact as well as pitch stories to. So I'm wondering, who here came in today because you actually have a story to pitch? No?
I'm just going to steal your ideas.
Yeah?
I mean, we have constant with the Village of Port Jefferson. Good example today is the Dickens Cincinnati Touch store earlier this morning. Your counterpart, News 12 is there, of course, but that's pretty cool. So we have constantly have events.
They're no
like
longer
that.
owned by
I
the
know,
state?
I know.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
But, so News 12, was there anybody else show up?
No, no, it's here.
You were here, okay.
But I'm sure there were 2 local, TVR, which you know, and Greater Long Island, I'm sure were there.
All right. So if you don't want to pitch stories, why did you come in today? What is it you want to know? Yeah.
I'm interested about the subject, the topic, which was, the purpose, and of course Newsday really, I think, reminded people the importance of local papers. But I'm also interested in the economy of it. A few years ago, the articles I was reading is that local papers were the only ones doing well in business. But just a week ago, they're saying local papers are dying because the advertising is going to the online giants and so forth. We've lost the classifieds, the mandatory legals and all of this. So how are people...
Okay. You want me to start with that? I'll start with that because it's kind of what I do. There's a couple different ways to look at it. Okay, so you may see headlines that talk about how local news is dying, even how daily newspapers are dying. If I'm looking to tell a story about the number of newspapers, then I could say, yes, the number of newspapers themselves are on decline. If I want to look at newspapers that are evolving into multimedia platforms, then I actually have more news than I had before. So it depends on who's telling the story. Now, a lot of times we see stories about how another local newspaper has just died. And they're counting newspaper to newspaper. They're not telling you if that newspaper just went out of print and evolved into online only.
May I clarify?
So, okay, but I'm going to get to a
this
bigger
particular
point.
story was about the consolidation, so then it's no longer really local because you have masses of, so that, and you even have, what is it, which is the name of the company? They're actually writing the stories in the Philippines and filtering them into these papers. That's what I mean.
Okay, now there's some of that going on too, but the media consolidation that was huge a decade or so ago, we're not seeing that so much anymore. Now what we're actually starting to see is media starting to break up and become more family-owned and more startup, which is what Pam is doing. And she's not the only one doing that on Long Island, though. But you are seeing a change, and basically the easiest way to describe the change is everything that's old is new again, okay? So we're going back kind of to the old days of the way media was run, but the difference is now it's done in the digital world. So that's the real story.
Just a comment, there is a big difference. Because when you go from dead trees to online, the economics are entirely different.
Well, let's
and
get
you're
to the
going
economics
lose,
separately now.
Well,
okay.
you're not going to have the same number of reporters. You won't have the depth of coverage because you're not going to generate the same revenue, and so you're going to have fewer staff members. And if you look at newspapers that have done this, that have gone from be daily to 2 or 3 days a week, and supplement that with digital, the staffs have shrunk dramatically in places around the country.
Okay, there's one thing I want to say though, to talk about the business model of news, because I run into so many people that misunderstand what this means. I run into people who say news is dying because no one's buying it and no one's paying attention to it. That's not what this means. The business model dying is no one is spending $50,000 to take out a full-page ad anymore when they can spend a few cents to get a click in the digital world. That's what we talk about when we say about the business model changing. And what we've seen evolve is paid-for subscriptions online. So the news you used to get for free, now they're asking you to spend $5, $10, $15 a month for it. That's part of the evolving change in the business model. Anybody want to talk about that?
And I should just point out, Jackie just illustrated why she's so good at her job. She's exactly correct about what is happening in the landscape. And we at Newsday are asking you to pay more for either an online subscription or the dead tree. And the reason we are is because we don't want to do what Mr. Blank is talking about. We want to have enough reporters that we can really cover Long Island as best as we possibly can. And I can give you an example of that. During Sandy, Newsday deployed a reporter in every single community on Long Island that we thought would be hit by Sandy 4 days before Sandy hit. Now I got to tell you, fortunately we were wrong in some cases. Some places didn't get hit, and that was a good thing, and we were able to ship those people to areas that were harmed. But at the end of the day, the value of Newsday or any media organization, both to our advertisers and to our subscribers, is our content. And that's why you see Pat Dolan, who owns Newsday, and one of the things that that Jackie was talking about is we're going back to the days of family ownership of major media outlets. Pat Dolan is willing to invest the money because he is his only shareholder. He doesn't have to worry about the quarterly earnings report. And he is frankly buying Newsday time to make that transition from where we make almost all of our money on the dead tree to where we're going to make our money through various revenue streams, whether it's online subscriptions, it's events, it's podcasts, it's Newsday live streaming. There are all sorts of ways Newsday itself needs to change if we're going to be relevant to Long Island the way we were in 1940 when Alicia Patterson started us.
Yeah,
I've been getting the Newsday since I was born, since like the 50s.
God bless you.
Yeah, so I really would rather read it digitally, but you can't just get, well now you can, but you couldn't just get a digital subscription. So I get the Sunday paper for $1 a week.
Right.
I never get around to the paper. I read what I want online, and I'm left with dead tree that I have to recycle. And I know you just went to a 340 a week or something. You just went to a digital.
A change in
Right.
subscription?
I'm now I'm in between the dead tree and the.
And it's difficult, you know, it's really like all of you, right? As consumers of news, the producers of news are all going through this transition. And I always say to people, when I started as a reporter, like I was at your panel today, sir, and news broke out, okay? Now, in the old days, I would have waited until everything was done, and then I would have gone to my office and typed a story that would have been in the paper the next day. That's not what you do today. Today you tweet the news out, then I go to the mobile office, better known as my car. I type out 5 graphs, it goes to newsday.com. I then talk to another reporter who covers energy for us because he needed something. And then there'll be a completely different piece that appears tomorrow morning. And there's a big feeling about the fact that news is continuous. And you don't give people the same news at 5 o'clock in the morning at 5 p.m. in the evening. Things change and we have to adapt. And if you're going to be an effective reporter for your institution, you have to do those things. I'm paid to report. I'm not paid to be in the office. I'm paid to be talking to people, collecting information, and getting it to you as quickly, fairly, and objectively as possible.
But I want to,
Did you have a point, Scott?
Yeah, so I just want to go back to
Yeah.
for a second, the idea that newspapers, community newspapers, local newspapers are dying. I think that's a false narrative for this reason, because if you take a look across the country, yeah, there are a lot of newspapers that are dying, but if you start to sort of dig in the weeds and look at which ones that are dying, their model is an old model that just, it's not a sustainable model. So what am I thinking about? New York Times just did a huge special section on one community newspaper and took a look at how that newspaper was doing. It's dying, it was going out of business. But then when you actually start to, a lot of people may not look at it through the lens that somebody who is actually in the business would, but you start to look at what they were doing, and it was basically press releases, it was basically, small community news engagements. Facebook replaced all of that. So you don't need a community newspaper to produce that kind of news. So I think the critical part now is to produce news, whether you're Newsday, Herald, Blank Slate Media, it doesn't matter. I forget the name of your publication. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, we just met. But it doesn't matter. But if you're not producing news that's relevant to people's lives, that has an effect on their lives, then you're going out of business these days. Because the idea that you could sustain yourself through press releases and wedding announcements and so forth, not that those things don't still go into papers, but you're sorely mistaken. So it won't last. And at the Herald, we've actually increased our footprint by 20% in the last 3 years. We've added staff. So we're not cutting, we're adding, as is the case with Newsday, I think, right?
We're hiring 40 people next year.
Yeah, right. So, it's not as though news is dying and the jobs are not going away, they're just changing.
Yeah.
but I got to say that I covered Huntington Town Board, and for the last several months, I was the only reporter there. And here's the circumstances. The Newsday reporter was tied up in the series for 6 months, and so she didn't show up. The backup person never showed up. The TBR reporter moved to Florida in March. The Long Islander is at death's door, so it didn't send anybody. So there is a gap in coverage. There's only so many stories one person can write, and so there definitely is a gap. I'm glad that Newsday's, Pat Dolan, I think he's probably saving Newsday as a decent newspaper, and I think weeklies and local papers in some cases have figured out the avenue, but it would be misleading to say that we're not seeing a drop-off in coverage around the country. I belong to a group called Lion, Local Independent Online News, and they are all encountering the same thing. Their local paper has died or cut back to 3 days, and there's nobody else covering it except that online paper.
Let me just give you a quick stat, and then we'll get to you, Steve. If you look at nationally, the newspapers that are going out of business, the mass bulk of them are a circulation of 5,000 or less. Okay, so those are your small community weeklies, which are basically operating, as Scott said, the old school traditional way, which is, I can't get an ad in the paper to pay my costs, therefore I have to go out of business. They don't have the skill sets, they don't have the ability to evolve into the multimedia format, which is what you, the consumer, is basically demanding today. Because you're no longer willing to wait for news to be written, edited, laid out, delivered to you the next day to find out what happened yesterday, right? So that's what's going on. So, the overall message is there is news is relevant, news continues to be important to you. It's just all messed up right now.
So, may I just ask, so as a follow-up, wouldn't you prefer at Newsday not having to put out a print paper, not having to do that dual thing at all? Wouldn't you prefer to
No,
just do the
there's a
thing?
legal ad issue. Only print can publish legal ads, and they're extremely useful.
And the other thing, in all honesty, we talk about this.
Right.
We talk about how long will we print a newspaper. And you may know, for example, that the Newsday that you get today is printed in College Point, Queens by the New York Times. How did that happen? We had to buy new presses because our presses were built in 1978. You don't buy new printing presses if you're not going to use them for at least 50 years. This is a capital investment of between $100 and $150 million. So Pat Dolan went to Arthur Sulzberger Jr., owner of the New York Times, to ask for advice. What do I do? You're a family-owned paper. I'm getting into this. I own Newsday. What should I do? Arthur Sulzberger Jr., they went to College Point, Queens. They talked about it, and they decided Arthur has all these presses he's not using. So they agreed for I believe it's 15 to 20 years, the New York Times will print Newsday. We will deliver the New York Times on Long Island, and the people that print your Newsday every day are the same people that printed it for 10 years, 15, 20 years. They're ex-Newsday employees that were hired by the New York Times. Now, that doesn't mean people didn't lose their jobs. Some people did lose their jobs, but there was a real effort to try to employ as many people who are truck drivers and pressmen at the New York Times. That's something else you're also seeing, is that newspapers in particular are cooperating much more on the non-editorial side.
Right.
Printing, trucking, advertising, there are all these joint deals where you, Macy's, can buy an ad in the Times and buy an ad in the Daily News and in Newsday, and there's a lot more cooperation than there used to be.
Yes, 1 second. I just want to point out one thing when it comes to, why not just go all digital? Some people still prefer the print format. Some people have no technology skills. So the print format, if it didn't exist, they don't have the ability to go online. There are lots of places in America where broadband is hard to find. I grew up in a part of the country where, 20% of the people had cable, and it's still that way. Dial-up still exists out there. You remember the AOL dial-up? That's still happening out there. So if that's the way you have to get your news, you would prefer the print, because to get the dial-up version, you're going to be there for days waiting for something to download. Go ahead.
Way back when, I used to be a daily newspaper reporter, and then I crossed over to the dark side and became a publisher.
Oh, no, not that.
Money.
And many of my former papers, and this is part of the story nationally of what's happened. So I worked for the Kansas City Star. There used to be a Kansas City Star, Kansas City Times. Ernest Hemingway used to work for the Kansas City Star as well. Two famous alumni. And there's now a Kansas City Star. There is no Kansas City Times. It may be publishing 3 days a week. I worked in Syracuse. There used to be a Herald Journal and a Post Standard. There's now a Post Standard that publishes 3 days a week in print and is online. So there has been a large shrinkage, and there has been a change in the mission of many daily newspapers in many markets, which actually is to the benefit of weekly newspapers.
Yeah.
Because Newsday is not covering local news the way it once did in terms of the villages and towns and communities. And this is sort of one of the keys to success in publishing today, which is unique content. The people who are doing well produce information that's important to people that they cannot get anywhere else. So you have the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post that are covering the impeachment scandal and all the things that are connected with it, and circulation is booming thanks to Donald Trump. And then on the other end, you have weekly newspapers who are writing about where you own a home and where your kids go to school and where you're going out tomorrow. And they want that, and they have expectations in terms of quality that that's going to be good. So I think that partly there's been a change. We were asked, we're actually distributed. We're printed by the Daily News. We have some of our papers are delivered to the New York Times to be inserted in Newsday bags that go out, because Newsday had approached us several years ago because they said, our readers, 50% of our revenue was coming from circulation, at least at that time. Our readers do want that local news. We don't have the manpower to produce it. How about you putting your papers in our bags? So we actually distribute our paper in that sort of cockabally way that has been created over there. So you're right, there's changes. Weekly newspapers have done well because of that. Now, I will say that I still think that I still think people want print. And we'll start with, I defy, show of hands, who read the Newsday series online?
The Divided Long Island
Today,
series?
did you not use your print product? I've got to think that the most
No.
tedious,
No, as a matter of fact, I pointed out to my media friends just how damn good that was produced. That was a changing moment, that piece.
That's video.
no,
If that's what you're talking about.
no, I'm talking about, but also, I will say that many people are going to sit there and want to read it, or look up on a screen for hours.
You're talking about the Divided Long Island
Right.
series, right? Okay,
Right.
I just want to make sure everyone's clear
Yes.
on what we're talking about. I read it all online. I
Okay,
didn't use the paper at all. The paper couldn't give me the data visualization. It couldn't bring me the video that was so powerful in explaining just how pervasive the issue is.
okay.
So to me, if that was a print-only investigation, I would have forgotten about it by now. That was the power of multimedia in my world. But you
Okay.
disagree with me.
Well,
I
That's
do.
fine, and it's fine too. Go
I just
ahead.
wanted to jump in here. So one, I think, in terms of online versus print, I think we don't need to get into that debate, because I think they both serve their useful purposes. Certainly for weekly newspapers, community-based newspapers, I think they will remain print-based for a very long time. We are the Herald Community Newspaper is now the only printer publisher after Newsday started publishing in Queens on Long Island. And there's a good reason for that, because the presses are literally running 24/7. I think the only time that they are down is Sunday afternoon. So it's not as though there isn't a real demand for print product. There is. I think there is definitely a generation that is an older generation that still demands it. Now, I think at some point, print will fade away. What point that is, that's a big subject of debate in our world. My guess is sometime between 10 and 20 years from now. But it's not an immediate question. I can tell you that. It's not an immediate question, because print is still making plenty of money. It just depends on who you are.
Yeah. I just want to point out something that Steve had mentioned about how, your hyperlocal news sources are making out well because your major dailies aren't able to cover the hyperlocal like they used to. That's happening everywhere. The New York Times, for instance, they're actually producing less business content now. Any idea why? So they had to take business reporters off of business and assign them with the political reporters, because we've never had a president the way we do now. And the political reporters couldn't understand the Trump business maneuvers that were going on. Okay, so they're covering less business, so now if I read the New York Times, I know I need to find some other outlet to bring me the business news that they used to. But they have to make these accommodations because no one can do everything today.
Right.
So that's part of the message here is you need to really diversify your media habits more than you had in the past, because everyone's making decisions that impact the information they're bringing you. So Newsday's not bringing you international and national news like it used to, because they're focused on local.
Well, yeah, and I'd be interested to hear what James has to say about that, because, you know, it was once upon a time, so I've been at the Herald for 26 years now, and going on 27, so that's a long time. So I've really seen the progression, and when we started out, there were maybe 3 weekly newspapers per community, 2 or 3 in our coverage area. The Herald bought them all out, but we were competing head to head against the other weeklies. But now, and we never worried about Newsday, because Newsday was worried about other things. It was national news, it was international news, it was Albany. Now Newsday, I mean, they have great reporters who are covering local beats. James and I talk oftentimes about Long Beach, where our reporters are going head to head against each other and producing really great local news. I mean, you know, there's a big story in Long Beach, you know, involving the county controller, which I don't need to get into, but, you know, us competing head to head with Newsday, I can tell you, we want to stay ahead of that story every step of the way, and they're the same way. And it's a friendly competition. We all like each other, but that's producing.
That's not what you said about James.
Well, Scott makes a really good point about competition. So I've lived in Long Beach since 1997. It has a lot of political issues. It's a great news town. The Herald keeps Newsday on its toes. If you talk to Newsday's reporter, John Asbury, who covers Long Beach for us, he is terrified about what Anthony is going to have. And that's good. That's good. You know, when there's a city council meeting in Long Beach, there's more than one reporter there. There are multiple reporters there, and there are multiple stories. And that makes Long Beach residents, there are 34,000 people who live in Long Beach, and they're, I gotta say, big news consumers because there's lots of issues in Long Beach. But Newsday is better if we have competition. The same with Steve's organization. Terrific reporting. Terrific report. The same with Pam, who, by the way, used to work at Newsday. But
Push him around.
competition makes us better. And one of the things that bothers me the most, I write a lot about industrial development agencies. I write a lot about the developments that we've all been talking about here today, because many of them have received tax incentives. When I go to an IDA meeting, I am the only reporter there most of the time. And yes, you know, they're going to answer my questions and things like that, but I may have one idea about what the story is, because remember, Newsday's got to be all of Long Island, whereas the community reporter who's writing for the community that development is going to be in would write a completely different story. But they can't be there because they're so busy, frankly, feeding the monster and feeding that news hole, they can never leave the office. And I tell people this all the time. One of the great benefits of having an owner like Patrick Dolan is that allows me to leave the office and to actually go interview people in person and do research in census data and things like that. But competition is critical. And the thing that I'm most concerned about is when I go to an event and it's me and no other reporters.
Cecilia, I want to go to Cecilia because we kind of overlooked broadcast.
I didn't want to interject, but
You know?
Yeah, but it also leads into the competition thing, because that was just upsetting
Yes.
everybody. And
Yeah.
I think that's where you're going with that. because-
You want to moderate us?
Well, I just, on the media point of view, your old company shuts down.
yes.
Right.
People are very upset, and it just goes to the trust thing. Because I immediately just felt untrusting of the news, knowing only News 12 would be there. And couple that with Trump, and you're like, who trusts the news anymore?
Okay.
Well, a lot of politicians agreed. If you kept up with the closure of FiOS, I mean, a lot of people spoke out about it.
Can you
But-
talk a little bit about the competition from the broadcast?
Well, it's funny. So I worked at News 12 Long Island for 10 years as an assignment editor before I went to FiOS to report. And back in the day, before there was no affiliation at the time with Newsday and News 12. When News 12 was strictly Cablevision, no relation to Newsday. We used to sit in the morning meeting every day. And if Newsday had a great cover story, and one of us would say in the meeting, oh, let's do this. One of the higher ups would say, but it's already in the Newsday, like they beat us, right? And it's a silly frame of mind because everyone has their own outlet, right? If you're a Newsday reader, you may not be watching News 12, vice versa. It doesn't really matter. And it's so funny though, for many years, if Newsday had something, the bosses would be, oh, well, it's old, Newsday has it, they beat us, blah, blah, blah. And that was the way of thinking. But I think that's slowly changing. But the other thing with competition that I think is a really negative impact of this environment we live in where everybody wants this instant gratification and getting stories on right away. Let's say there's a great story, we know about it, we think others may know about it, but it's going to take some time. Well, guess what? I mean, at FiOS, and I'm sure other places, there was a very, very, very strict and strong demand that we had to get a noon on every day. We had to get at 4 o'clock on every day. There were metrics that we had to meet, and often, a boss may pick something that is not as competitive as a story. It may be a lighter story because we had to have content. And the other problem with TV news, I think, and it's around the country, is that, there are several I was writing down. One is News 12 is hyper-local. FiOS advocated for the same thing using different phraseology, but everybody wants to be hyper-local. But then there's being too hyper-local, right? If you're a TV station, you don't have the resources of Newsday. You don't have, I don't know how many reporters you have. I know you said 350
We
people.
have more than 100.
More than 100 reporters, right? Any given day, FiOS News 12 has 5 reporters in the field. Channel 2 has 2 Long Island reporters. Channel 4 has just 1, but sometimes they'll send someone from the city. Channel 7 has 2, okay? That's not a lot of people. So I think there's really a concern for being too hyper-local because as the bosses, they look at a story and they say, this is a great story for that community in, let's say, Bayshore, but does the rest of Long Island care about it, or are they going to turn the channel? That's a real important issue, and it's a topic of great debate because it really comes down to how many people will actually be interested in watching this story. The other thing I'm seeing happen is that there are so many TV reporters who aren't invested in their communities. They see Long Island as a stepping stone to New York City. Because even though we're in the #1 market, Long Island is not really New York City, right? And I'm seeing over the years, I mean, when I first started years ago in this business, everybody, for the most part, wanted to stay here, wanted to work here. But you see now as the TV business is really struggling, the pay is, I mean, it's almost unlivable. Almost everyone I know who works in TV news has a side job or I was babysitting on the weekends. And I'm in my 30s. So I think that's a real problem, and I think it a place, with all my co-panelists here, you have people, it's so different, print and TV in a way, because there are so many people in TV that just aren't invested, or they try to be, but they're coming here from Texas because they got a job wherever, at whatever station. But it's a real problem. And if you're not invested in your community, or you haven't had time enough to be, who's coming to you with the good stories? Do you have sources? I mean, it takes years to build sources. And I think the only reason I got hired at FiOS without having been on air before is because I had a great Rolodex from my 10 years at News 12. I mean, as an assignment editor, if you don't know, is somebody who basically, if you called to pitch a story, I would be the one to take the call. And then when Newsday came into the mix with News 12, I would often do the conference calls in the morning with Newsday and do all that. But in being invested in your community is more important now than ever as a local journalist, because if you're not, or if you really don't care, or if you're just seeing a job as a stepping stone, you're in trouble. You just are.
So let me give you a little bit of perspective on that. Cecilia mentioned, so Long Island is part of the New York metro area for television coverage. So it is the #1 market in the country and basically the world for television coverage. If you are covered by Channel 7, Channel 2, Channel 4, that means what compared to being covered on News 12?
The whole metropolitan area.
It's a big deal? You're right, the whole metro area sees you as opposed to Long Island specific. So when you pitch stories or you expect stories to be covered, you need to pitch them stories that appeal to the whole metro area. So instead of saying this is an important Long Island issue, you need to crouch it in the conversation of this is important to the whole metro area. They just don't know it yet.
No.
You see the difference? Now, if you think the outlook for television is kind of sketchy right now, let me tell you about Long Island radio, all right? Nassau and Suffolk counties comprise the 20th largest radio market in the country. We have between 18 and 19 commercial radio stations, okay? Not counting your college stations, not counting WSHU, your public radio. We have 0 news reporters. Do we realize that? Our largest radio company is Connoisseur Media, which owns 5 radio stations. About 2 years ago, the FCC and FEMA demanded a mandatory emergency alert system test. Those 5 stations failed. What does that mean for your safety? Right? So a lot of times we focus so much on media bringing us stories, we forget their true reason for all of the media that we have comes down to your health and welfare. All right? So on that happy note, Steve, I thought you had your hand up for something else.
I'll leave it right there.
Yeah, so can I now make a pitch for print? Before I was saying as a...
No, you were anti-print before, you have to stay that way.
I'm not anti-print because I was saying from an operating cost point of view, you all probably would love to get rid of having to produce a second whole thing. But wait.
If we could have the advertising revenue.
Okay.
If we had the advertising revenue, we would be thrilled to get rid of the print.
Yeah.
But the ad that you get in print, you cannot get a fraction of that online.
Okay,
So
but now
the
when you make the
economics,
pitch-
which is why subscriptions have, and digital subscriptions have become a big deal because advertising revenue doesn't go from print to digital because you lose that. So now you have to charge people for the news.
So may I just make a pitch for what print does that you haven't mentioned? You talked a little bit about the older people, et cetera.
The puppies.
People, to me, it's like stocks and bonds in terms of a person looking for coverage. It's like stocks and bonds. People don't go online and read like this and get attracted to a headline. They typically will search for a story or a topic or something. They rarely just kind of get new information that they wouldn't otherwise be looking for. Also, most of the onlines are very cumbersome. They're not really usable at all. The Times might be a little bit better, the way they do it, but even there are stories that I saw it in the newspaper and I wanted to get it online. You can't even find it. I have to do a trick. And their own online search, I actually have to go out to Google to get back into the Times to get to the story. But my point being, and it's an important point, the way people discover stories that they don't even know they want to read is because they'll go like this to a newspaper. And they don't do it online.
Can I interject though? I'm, for example, the Newsday app, I get alerts all day, and I would actually disagree with you to a point. I see what you're saying, but if you sign up, and there are some sites where I think you can tailor your alerts to subjects or areas you may want. But I get Newsday alerts all day long, and I read almost all of
It's
them.
not the
you
same,
still
I know what
have
you're
to
saying.
know-
You read the New York Times.
Well, I know what
and
she's
there's
saying, but
all kinds of stories that
It's
you
as simple as this.
never would see.
This.
No, I
Turn to this.
get
But
it.
that's
It's
not
not the
that
same,
way.
it's not the
This
same.
is now this.
It's not
Scroll
the
up
same.
instead of turning it
No,
back.
Sorry, what do you
Oh, no,
say?
she actually brought up a point I was going to say before, because I'm a huge consumer of news. I
Just
Google.
across the board, no matter the
Yeah, I
matter
mean,
the format?
I subscribe, I still read, I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, like, I like the print version, you know, if you have the time to, like, read, like, what's going on in some country that you wouldn't think about, like, normally, like, oh, okay, I wouldn't have known that. And not to say I don't read stuff online, too, because, yes, I get alerts all day as well. But, I mean, maybe I'm an outlier.
Well, things like health and science news, you read the New York Times and you're
Yeah.
flipping through, it's like, oh, I should know about
Exactly,
that.
like, you
I
may not
wouldn't
know.
necessarily see it online because you're caught up in all the political stuff and everything, and you get distracted by the sidebars
Right.
to it and the graphics, and you never get back to those
Yeah,
secondary
but I don't want to read
stories.
Donald Trump, like, all day long. I'm like,
Right.
oh, wait, there's something else in here, you know, like,
Right,
so.
exactly.
I want to go all the way to the other end of the room here.
So I want to throw out this idea that perhaps the online versus print is really a demographic issue, that it has to do with that there was a time that when I was 50, I'm not that, unfortunately not there anymore, but it's like when you're 60 and over, you want to have a newspaper in front of you.
Well,
And so now that generation is getting older, and pass it on. And the younger generation is all into the social media, is into the apps, into their phone, and that's where they're getting their main content from. And that's
Except
part of
parents
the whole
like to
transition
clip,
that's
parents
going
like to
on.
clip print stories about their kids. You'd be surprised what people want in print.
Well, that's why you have Huntington Now.
You have to print out my site.
But just to speak to that point though, so I understand what you're saying. It's not just a demographic issue though. I really think it's an education issue, and here's why. Because when you're talking about online journalism, most of it is breaking news. I mean, most of it is, there are plenty of full-fledged packages like Newsday's package, but a lot of it's breaking news and a lot of it's wrong. A lot of it is undersourced. A lot of it is, sort of the first take on the news.
Right.
And the value of print is the permanence of the print. That, if you watch a film like All the President's Men and the care with which they made to make sure that they were right and multi-sourced at every point, that added value to the news. You knew you had a certain trust in that news. You mentioned before there was a trust deficit. I think the trust deficit comes from online journalism because, barring the great packages with wonderful multimedia, a lot of it is not entirely correct. I mean, it's not entirely wrong. Most of it is correct, but the idea that there will be errors in the news is sort of built into that model.
But when it's in the dead tree, then you read it and you don't see the update 6 hours later. Digital, there'll
Yeah,
be
well,
an
but
update.
here's the thing: is that I think what you're talking about when you're talking about the deeper features, there's a certain
Permanent?
weight to
Yeah.
a print edition that you're not getting online. And I think that young people, if we are to preserve the news business, have to understand what we once upon a time had. And that was true with the TV news business. I think, I'm not an expert there, but you had the 5 o'clock news and you spent all day working on it. Now, because of the online, you have to constantly break the news.
Agreed.
Well,
I mean, I don't want to talk to that. But
To
yeah.
Scott's point, we had a very interesting situation recently. And as a news organization, you have to hold to your standards regardless of what the platform is. We had a situation just a few days ago where a very prominent Long Islander unfortunately ran over his wife in the driveway. And so we had all the same information everyone else had, but we could not confirm, was it Peter Richard of PC Richard and Son or was it not? And so we kept holding the story. We would not put it online until we could determine, yes, indeed, the Peter Richard that is in the police report is the Peter Richard who ran PC Richard and Son with his brother, Gary. And literally, we went around and around for hours on this because the editors were very specific. Look, it's a much different story if it's Peter Richard of PC Richard and Son than Peter Richard that no one ever knew. And we finally, and the police did not know.
Right.
They had no clue. So we talked to the family, and this is obviously a tragedy in the family, so it's going to take a little while to get the family to find a spokesman and figure out who's going to confirm it. And we were beaten by a number of media organizations.
TV.
But we were adamant that, look, people turn to Newsday in whatever form it is, and they expect the truth. And we have errors every single day, and we proudly print our corrections every single day. But you gotta hold your standards regardless of what the platform is. And the editors decided, look, it's better to get beat than to be wrong. Because everyone remembers the wrong.
Yeah.
And you can never ever take that back. I always tell my reporting colleagues all the time, you're only as good as your last story.
That's true.
If you screwed it up, you're in big trouble. And I'm not talking about your employment. I'm talking about your reputation. That's all you have as a reporter is your reputation.
We're gonna go Pam, Steve,
Yeah.
and then we'll
See,
get back to questions.
I ran the story, but I knew this rumor was about who he was. But you've got an 83-year-old guy who's backed over his wife of X number of years, 79 years old, after she's returned from walking her grandson to the bus stop. So that is such a great story in itself. I didn't wait to confirm who
She doesn't
he
mean
was.
great.
And needs to be told. Because, by the way, another issue that often comes up on Long Island is whether older drivers should be driving.
Yeah.
Right.
So I only much later, after Newsday and everybody else had the business about who he was, only later did I stick a sentence in, because I was less caught up in wondering who he was, although it's a big deal, than just the story itself. This is another problem. You are forced online to sometimes go against your better principles and standards, because there's so much stuff that's floating up from people who are pretending to be journalists and publishing anything anywhere. And you're constantly you feel a pressure to respond to that. So that's a whole other kettle of fish.
Steve?
It's kind of a field, but it's sort of been referenced here. And I think it's very important for the industry, which is the notion of fake news.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And this is, this is something that Donald Trump has been very successful.
Yes.
Because he doesn't, the facts indicate the truth and facts work against him. So, like any person in that position, it's easier to, if you don't have the facts, then you muddy the water. And I think it's a real danger where you hear a lot of people saying fake news. And much of what that is news that the president doesn't like. And I think the acceptance of that from an industry where people say fake news really diminishes the quality, and it's a very, very dangerous thing. At bottom, it's probably the most dangerous thing that can happen to a democracy is you don't believe that is that the inability to trust facts that are presented to you and have them done. So I think it goes in with conversations and people throw it out sort of glibly as fake news. When I hear that Trump has won. He's managed to muddy the waters enough where people don't trust. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Okay, now, do we know the definition of fake news? Because as Steve pointed out, it just gets bandied about. Someone reads something that's wrong. They say, oh, that was fake. Someone reads something that says, oh, well, I know another fact that wasn't included in that story, therefore it's fake. Those are inaccurate ways to use fake. Okay, fake news is actually the made-up stories that were designed to bring down democracy. That's what fake news is.
It's called propaganda.
So,
It's disinformation, it's
propaganda is a
and there
term
is fake news.
that has different connotations too, because people feel anything government releases is propaganda. So that's something different
Or
too.
disinformation, which
You can
do
use
see,
that, yeah.
And we have an entire network that
But
propagates fake news.
Fake news is not news that has an ear in it, is what I'm trying to say.
I know, it's not, like you make a mistake.
Right.
It's a purposeful misrepresentation.
Correct.
which
So what
is
I'm
fake
saying
news.
is the fake news term
Yes.
has now legs where people just call everything fake news.
Well,
Okay,
people are
and that's
applying
what
it to
it's about.
anything they disagree with. So for example, I wrote a story a few weeks before the election about a Republican candidate who had not paid $228,000 or $88,000 in sales taxes.
Uh-huh.
So I wrote that story, and somebody I had written a number of very nice stories about. He runs a little wildlife group, you're probably familiar with it. And he goes on and he says, my story is fake, it's a lie, and I've just made it up, and I'm biased. And I'm thinking, geez, man, I've written all these stories about you, and you liked them then, but now you've just put this label on. It's a very Trumpian label applied to things that people, it's not just that they find something wrong with it, they literally don't like it, so they call it fake. And that spreads all over online.
So let me be clear, the people here, they're not in the fake news business, all right? So who has questions? Yes.
No, I just was going to say that I think fake news really has become, like you were saying, it's whatever we consume that doesn't support our own preconceived biases.
Yes.
So if I'm a staunch liberal, if anything conservative is fake news. Well, what's happened really during this administration is that the president has been leveraging that. Anything that isn't flattering of his administration is fake news. And I agree, that's very dangerous when you have the leader of the free world demonizing the media. And the last president, his last press conference, he said we need a free and fair and objective news media. We have to have people that hold us accountable. And then this guy comes in and just everything is fake news. That's very scary to me.
Well, and it spread very quickly too.
Yes.
I'm just going to say that I'm not all that worried about the notion of fake news. And here's why. Because it's not the first time. Certainly under Nixon, he made very similar charges. He didn't use the word fake, but he made very similar claims on a consistent, constant basis. And in the end, the truth won out. And I do believe that in all of these cases, the truth will eventually win out. I mean, there are fantastic reporters working for Washington Post, New York Times, that are doing great work, investigative work. It's interesting, this is a little different dynamic this time, but very similar circumstances. But if you go back all the way to the founding of our country, there's a consistency there where there's always been fake news, and I think the idea is that so long as you have real news, the real news will eventually win out, and I do trust the American people that eventually the real news will win out.
Let me take some more questions, because I want to wrap up soon, because we're getting long on time.
So I wanted to sort of extend what you were saying. So some of the reporters that I know are in the White House now started at community newspapers.
Sure.
And that I'm really pleased and proud to have been able to follow their careers and look back for some of the articles that they wrote back in the day. And a lot of things have been digitized, but one of the frustrations I have with community newspapers is that you can't find stuff online. I like to read real papers, but I can't find some of my, somebody has to put it on a copy machine and PDF something to send me a grainy article, and that's still today. And I'll still get my news that way, but so I don't know what the cost implications are for that. But what I also want to ask about is, I'm going to air quote, citizen journalism. Right, because that's a big propagator of stories that may or may not be real, but it sort of starts something down a certain path. So how do you get it back? Some of it is totally fake, like legit capital letters fake, but somebody starts it because they want to, because they like that better than the truth, and some of it's really essential to getting something out there. So how do you then follow something that is like citizen journalism, or you incorporate it into what you do, and then how do we progress everything so that we have the option of online versus.
So couple things there. One, community newspapers, it depends on the community newspaper. So if it's a really small community newspaper, they may not have a website, that's true. But if you take a look across Long Island, there are great websites. LongIslandHerald.com is one of them. We have one of the largest websites outside of Newsday. It's the largest news website on Long Island. If you go out to Suffolk, there's Suffolk Times, there's Southampton Press, Riverhead News Review, 27 East. There's a real, I would check them out, because there's a real broad number of community newspapers that have great websites.
But there used to be a directory of all of the community and local papers.
Still exists.
Still exists.
Press Club Long Island, we can get you one if you want. And it has all of our websites, all of our contact.
My organization actually does online. We have a data visual map of reporters covering what geographical area of Long Island.
Awesome.
With their
Yeah.
So the information does exist. It's just, you need to know it's out there.
No, I think though, just to I don't want to take up too much time, but just to kind of further with that, I think that many community newspapers remain print first editions. So we remain a print first edition, and our online is secondary. So we go breaking news only online, and then the rest of it is a print product because, I think Steve's mentioned this a number of times. The money is in print, so you have to remain true to your product. Now we've been working more online. We've been doing much more online, but I don't think that's going to change anytime soon for most community newspapers.
We actually are different. We went to, we're WordPress, which is a common platform, the most common platform, and we put everything online first. We did go to a paywall in terms of getting the readership. So now, when you go to the paywall, you're going to get unlimited access to the paper, and you get the paper. You get unlimited access to the website and the paper. And I think that's what you see, that's what I've seen other weekly newspapers on Long Island do. And I think there are different readers. So I think there are the people that are going to be the online reader, and there is going to be the print reader. And I am one of those people who believe that people will ultimately, they do like the newspaper. One thing I just want to say demographically, because this is what I was hearing here, that young people don't read newspapers. And here's the thing, this is what I was taught as a young reporter. Young people never read newspapers. People who are 25 to 34 or 18 to 34, they were going out to clubs and they were going out to restaurants and going to concerts and things like that. And then they got married and they bought a house and they had kids. And all of a sudden, they're very interested in the local news, what's going on. So I think that the notion that young people no longer want it and they won't read newspapers, they never wanted it. You didn't read it when you were like 21 years old, unless you were strange like me.
And there is, we talked a little bit about how some community papers are going out of business because they don't have the skill set to morph into the digital age. I don't know if you're familiar with this phenomenon where you have your print weekly newspaper that does have a website, but when you go to the website, it's actually the PDF of the print. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Those do exist out there, so, yes.
Two things. When I say young people, I'm talking about even people in their 40s or whatever, because they're all used to picking up their iPad, or picking up their tablet, or they're picking up their smartphone or whatever. It's not just that demographic that you talked about, 18 to 24. But the real problem, in my view, with fake news has to do with the social media, and there's really no restriction on it. The mainstream media, as far as I'm concerned, as one connoisseur of news, is absolutely right on track in terms of the research and the homework that they do. It's what's happening that there's not enough control on the social media, the Facebook, the Google, because it's almost like if you put in advertising, they're not even looking to see if the advertising is accurate. And that's, to me, the biggest problem and the biggest issue right now.
Well, here's the thing. This is already on Facebook.
Well,
I already tagged Pam. It's already been liked.
Here's the difference. Here's the big
For
difference.
someone in this room.
And when you're looking at digital revenue, all of it's going to Facebook and Google.
Yes.
So when you talk about the revenue, and here's the very dangerous thing that we're living with. We are publishers. Publishers can be sued for what goes in there. If somebody writes a letter to the editor, expresses an opinion, and it libels somebody, we are named as a defendant and we are sued for carrying it. Mark Zuckerberg does not face liability for anything that appears on his website because he is considered, there's a law passed by Congress that says they are a platform and therefore are not liable.
Well, this is also not a new phenomenon, because if you go back to the Nixon era, there was actually an ad in the New York Times, a $4,000 ad, full-page ad, that sent in by the RNC secretly and furtively, and they actually published a fake news ad within the New York Times supporting Richard Nixon and some of his policies at the time in Vietnam. And so it's not a new phenomenon. It's just it's on a more global scale with Facebook, which is different. But it's been going on since our country was founded.
But it's also an opportunity for us as well.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons the president has been successful in his fake news campaign is that we in the media just assume that you know how we do our jobs every day.
Right.
And we need to be out there explaining exactly what we do. That, for example, after I write a story, it is read by 5 people before you even see it on the website. And then another 5 people look at it before it ever goes into the dead tree. So if I want to do fake news, I got to get 10 people to agree to my fake news. Now, when I talk to community groups and I explain fake news this way, they start nodding their head, realizing, well, gee, you couldn't do fake news at Newsday because there's no way you could get 10 Long Islanders to agree on anything. But it is an opportunity, and you're seeing different organizations, different media organizations, both newspapers, television stations, radio stations, websites, but also organizations like SBJ leading the charge to do more education. Jackie has played a major role in this, in helping the public have a better understanding about how to be a good news consumer. So So there's an opportunity here too, as well as a threat to democracy that we need to be worried about.
Well, there is, and that's backed up by data, because if you look at what people believe in terms of both advertising and editorial content, people are believing, they have trust. There's 67% at least trust newspapers. Social media is about 25%. It's the least trusted medium for information. A lot of people see it, but it has the lowest trust factor. So that's important. When you're competing for advertising dollars, that becomes particularly important. But it also says something about readership and why people will go to newspapers.
Okay.
And just quickly on fake news, speaking to James saying it's an opportunity, for me, I was so fearful for a long time because so many people would harass me in the field, screaming it at me. But it wasn't just that. It made my job so much more difficult because I would approach people and they wouldn't want to talk to me, and I'd say, why? And I would have to explain. They said, well, everything you do is fake. And I said, well, give me an example of my station, or give me an example of a local Long Island outlet. And nobody ever could. And I've actually had people I've gone to interview, and they say after a few minutes, oh, well, I guess it's just, I don't want to name outlets, but you know, there are some to the left and some to the right. And they're like, I guess, yeah, you're right, local news, it isn't really one-sided. And if you think about it, it's true. We're probably the best resource these days for the most objective news you can possibly have. But going back to an opportunity, it made me a better journalist because I would read my story 3 extra times to make sure that I didn't have even the most minute error in my story, because I was so afraid, I still am, of being accused of being a fake news reporter. Now look, yes, it's not, the actual definition is lost on people, but what matters to me is that I never have any error. And for a long time, I mean, I would read my story again and again, and I'm under, extremely tight deadlines, but I was so fearful of being called out because that is the time we're living in. So I think it actually made me a better journalist, but it's also made our lives so much more difficult. Even just trying to get interviews, there are people who won't do interviews.
And having a correction, you feel terrible. You feel absolutely, it ruins your day, believe me.
Yeah.
You feel so bad, and you're trying to think, how did that happen? Oh my God, you keep replaying it over and over again.
Yeah.
And Newsday has a policy where we correct even if you're not asking for a correction. So like if I find something wrong in my story, I go to my boss and I say, we've got to run a correction. No one has to call to demand a correction. If there's something wrong, we've got to correct it. And part of the reason we have to correct it, you all know, we need to be truthful to you, the public. But the other reason is because if we don't correct it, we're going to repeat the mistake because it'll be in the library.
Right.
So when I do a Nexus search and the article's wrong, I'm just going to repeat the error. So it's also very important to correct at all times. But I have to tell you, it makes you feel absolutely horrible. It's the worst. It's just terrible.
Well, and the interesting thing about the media and the First Amendment is that it allows for a media ecosystem. So there are all kinds of media outlets out there. I mean, there's such a diversity right on this small panel here. And that's the strength of the media, is its own diversity, whether it's community newspapers, television stations, internet. I mean, it's just the diversity of media is just expanding. That's good for our country. The things that I worry about are some of the things that happened, say, during the Nixon administration when journalists were actually wiretapped. I mean, really, the entire Watergate began in the late 60s, early 70s, with journalists who were being wiretapped. And they only came to that conclusion later on. Everybody talks about the DNC, but they forget that it really began with wiretapping journalists, so-called subversives, so-called radicals, and that, if you're going to wiretap journalists, that's the kind of thing that I worry about. You want to call us fake news? You can call us fake news. We know who we are. We're not changing.
And Scott, as you know, in the Spoda trial, one of the interesting things we just learned is that one of the police officers who was leaking to Newsday reporter Tanya Lopez, they tapped his phone because they wanted to know who he was talking to. And it's very frightening. It's happening today. I mean, these trials, actually, just one aside, are very interesting because it does show you how government works, how law enforcement works.
What I want to do is I want to see if we have any more questions, and then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to wrap up with any closing thoughts because we're running out of time here. Down here?
Yeah, just a comment. Yes, the news are presented very objectively. All of you I respect. But the issue that I have is that I understand the newspapers, they are a for-profit business, right? I mean, my degree is in finance. I mean, we're in the business of making money. We have to make money. But then there are certain papers that choose to continue to put same negative stories on the same certain community, the Latino community, the brown community, all right? And when we tell them to please, can you post the good news, the positive stuff about Latinos? It's like, well, that doesn't sell, so it's not posted. What is the responsibility then of the newspaper or the media then? What is their responsibility in terms of they are helping to paint an entire community with the same paintbrush? What is their responsibility? The demographics are changing. It is expected that after the 2020 census, Suffolk County is going to reach a Latino population of 20%, and I can assure you that none of us, no, most of us are not MS-13. There, I gotta say it. And Pam, no, because we work together.
Yeah, so if I could just ask that real quick. So a couple of things. One, at Hofstra, where I'm a professor, we have a community journalism program where we are working to bring in more Latinos, more African Americans into journalism. So we're encouraging young people who are of African American descent or Latino descent to actually become journalists, because if you look across the country, there's a lack of Latino and African American journalists. And in fact, in most newsrooms at major dailies or small to mid-sized dailies, it's zero. So I think that has an effect on the news. At our newsroom, we're very conscious of making sure that we hire Latino and African American journalists. So 25% of our newsroom is either African American or Latino. I think that has a profound effect on our coverage because, yes, you're coming through it through the lens that you've grown up with, your background, and you understand the story better. So that's critical to us at our newsroom. I mean, I can't speak for every newsroom. I know that's certainly true at Newsday, but you know.
Well, I can give you 2 points. One is if sensational news sold and made money, none of these guys would have had to morph into multimedia, okay? There would be plenty of money to be made in media, and that's not the story that's being told. So anyone who's telling you they're doing stuff because it's sensational, I wouldn't talk to them anymore, quite frankly. But two, the other thing is, you know, I deal with a lot of communities that feel like they're being misrepresented because all you see is the negative coming out. What happens is, to get those positive stories out, there needs to be an actual effort and action items behind that so that those positive stories are getting out to the media and these people are being called and told about it. And usually that's the weak link, in that there's no real concentrated effort for that to be happening. You know the good things are happening, but it's not reaching the media.
Well,
so that's the link that is usually missing.
Jackie's
well,
right.
Let me tell you, the issue with the MS-13, right? In Huntington, we had, after 12 years of advocacy, we started a soccer program with the police department, PAL, right, with the police department. That was amazing. We have 200 Latino youth playing soccer with police officers. Yeah, we reached out to, I'm not gonna give a name, but one of the, Newsday.
Yeah.
They didn't run it. They didn't run it.
Okay.
But it was very popular on my site.
But I was going to finish that because I called Pam, and I'm like, Pam, could you please? And she knows.
Yeah.
I don't even need to call her anymore. She's there. You know?
So now you have to train more people the way you have Pam trained.
No, but, and not only that, but like, for instance, one of my colleagues' daughters, she was an intern at Newsday, and she was hoping to be hired, and she's Latina, and unfortunately, she wasn't hired. So, I mean, obviously, I don't know, you know, how good or bad she was. I don't know, but she comes. Her father is a surgeon who lives in Lloyd Harbor, and we wanted to do a piece on him. That wouldn't sell either, so no one wanted to speak about Dr. Hernandez either.
So,
Yeah,
I don't
there's
know.
a lot of
There is
different
a
things going
resent-
on in the stories you're saying here.
There is a resent-
It's like a separate workshop altogether, I'm afraid.
No, but I'm just saying that it's just there is a certain resentment that at some point, you know, it's going to be very negative to an entire community, not immigrant, just brown in general.
Well,
I would say, though, we spent a year in Brentwood profiling the Brentwood community. And one of the reasons we did that is exactly what you're talking about. We were concerned that Newsday readers would think that every Latino community is just MS-13.
Right.
We are not perfect. I'm the first one to tell you that. We are not perfect. But one of the things that was so interesting in doing this year-long, in-depth look at Brentwood, which is a community that has been scarred by a lot of violence, is we wanted to show Brentwood is like every community on Long Island. It is no different than white communities, black communities, Asian communities. The wants, the needs, the dreams of people are the same. And one of the things you try to do is bring people together. We don't always succeed. And I'm sorry we haven't done all the stories that you wanted us to do. I would say every single day we have to make very difficult choices. And 9 times out of 10, we're not making the right choice. We're upsetting someone. I have to tell people no every single day who call me with a good story. But there are only so many stories we can do every day. What I think is interesting about the Brentwood situation is the community. We could never have done this series without the community's help. People really reached out, volunteered their time, opened their hearts to us, and they trusted us. And that was a leap of faith. They trusted us, but because they did, our story was so much more powerful than it would have been if they had not trusted us.
I'd like to also make the point that Newsday may not be the venue for those community stories.
Yeah.
They are dealing with, they have an island-wide audience, and I can tell you that anything east of Roslyn, many of our readers couldn't care less, or south of Old Country Road, they couldn't care less.
That's just the point. It's not a Huntington story. It is a Long Island story.
Well, not the fact that there's a PAL. And MS-13 is going to be a story. For us, we'd be very interested in doing it, and I think for Scott's papers, we'd be very interested. So sometimes the venue of where it's going to be, you need to look at really the role of the newspapers that are here. We are the people doing that local community news by and large. And, you know, unfortunately, when you have something like MS-13, it's sort of like the mafia for Italians, where you have this issue and people tend to be tarred by this. I think that's why we have the Columbus Day Parade
To make up for
Columbus
that.
Day is to make up for that sort of stuff.
But that only fits into the fact that if I'm a brown person, for instance, and I go to Lloyd Harbor, you know, I don't let my brown son go into certain rich areas because I'm afraid that someone might do something or say something. He might be victim of this law. He has already been victim, being discriminated against, you know, bullying and. I don't know, I mean, this is probably a whole other.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I feel bad cutting you off, but yeah, we're getting kind of off track here.
One thing I will
We gotta
say,
close
one
out.
thing I will
Yeah.
say, it was Newsday that, and they were the only people that had the resources, and they did an extraordinary job on the housing. And they showed
Pilar was in
probably the most dramatic thing and probably the best thing that could be done in terms of affecting change was their exposure of how brown and black people were being discriminated upon. So I think that you also have to give credit to Newsday. And that's their kind of, for that type of story, it would take a Newsday to do that. For the local coverage, that's more our ballpark and the type of things that we'll do.
So I want you to set up a lunch with Steve. So he can explain all this to you, okay? No.
Absolutely,
You
I'll
really
be happy
should.
to.
Okay, good. Any final questions? I need questions. We need to wrap up because we're long on time now.
I just, well, going slightly off topic, what do you, I see that a lot of, like online publications are going to a nonprofit ownership, like in the city, like Gothamist was taken over by WNYC, and then they have a publication called The City. And I remember, because I'm just on their email list, and I go, you know, you give donations, so do you see, like, where do you see that going, like the nonprofit ownership?
I personally don't see it necessarily taking off on a widespread scale right now because it is a non-profit.
Yeah,
It's the
I
idea
know.
of non-profit, and as was mentioned, newspapers are for-profit.
Yeah.
You know, I think it'll become a model for certain journalists who are able to do it and want to do it. But But it's also important to remember that there are a lot of newspapers that are still very profitable. I mean, there's this idea that no newspapers, I can tell you the Herald's very profitable. You know, it's if there were, you know, if newspapers were going under the way everybody seems to project they are, then you would see more nonprofits.
Right.
But I don't see that now because there are a lot of them are still very profitable.
And
A
the
lot of
nonprofit
nonprofits-
model has its
Yeah.
own challenges.
Yeah.
Because now
Yeah,
you're
a lot of
relying on
challenges.
funding
Yeah, and
and
that's
donations.
tough.
And you don't know year to year.
And
how
that-
that's
And
gonna
a lot of
be.
them are connected to foundations or other community
Yeah.
groups that help form the board that governs what they do, and that's their reason for being allowed to be a nonprofit. It would be rare for somebody like me, just by myself, to try to turn into a nonprofit.
Right.
In fact, I think it'd be pretty, I'm not profitable, but to be an official nonprofit is a long and complex operation.
Right.
You're a nonprofit, but not by choice.
Last question.
I just wanted to make a comment. I still read the physical paper. I like it. You know, I mean, yes, I read it. I get Newsday alerts all the time. I get patch alerts. I get LIVN. I get freaking every Newsday, every alert you could possibly get. News reporter, like Twitter. But I mean, but also I watched to your point, I watched the video online of the Newsday, which was really well published, you know, produced. But also I did read, I picked out different areas in the paper that I wanted to zero in on and read more about. So, you know, the print and the video and the apps and whatever is really important. So you get a whole rounded outlook of everything.
So that should make you all feel better.
But I would also add, isn't film coming back for cameras? Isn't vinyl coming back for records?
everything-
Everything old, you start off saying everything old again is new.
All right, so closing thoughts, Steve, and we'll go down the line.
Well, I think that we're living in a time of incredible change. This is, I don't know, in terms of industrial revolutions, pick your number. But we're in a time of dramatic change that's taking place. I think that what has been said is that newspapers that are embracing the change and taking advantage of it are those that are going to survive. That yes, they are migrating to things on video or podcast because they can. I also think that it offers tremendous opportunities in a way of covering local news that we never had before. Going back to the days of film, I remember when people would send us Polaroids of some community event and tell us not to lose it, which of course we would. There's now an opportunity to really share more news. And really, I think that there's an opportunity for engagement that newspapers want. You know, in truth, people say the easy part is actually getting the bad news. I always thought that getting the soft news was the hard part, because you'll hear from police, you'll see the fire engines, and you'll get the police report, and you'll find out who was arrested. It is those community things that is always harder for us to learn about out there. Facebook has helped us, but I would say engage with your newspapers. Don't limit them to Newsday. Don't shun Newsday, but don't limit yourself to Newsday, because there are a lot of different places, online and in print, that you can get your story out now that you can't before.
I'd like to close on the internet. I think there are two important points which are really important. One is, I think that every journalist just has to be so cautious about this, and I mentioned it earlier, this instant gratification and getting stuff out there, because you really can never be too careful. And I mean, it's one thing to, of course, want to get some, everybody wants to get a story out first, of course. But I think there has to be an understanding among all journalists that, and James spoke to this about Newsday waiting with the PC Richard story, that it is so much better to not be first and get something right. I see mistakes all the time. You even see tweets, and you see these things, and they're meant to be clearly well intended, but a minor mistake in this environment that we're living in, and every journalist is being watched and criticized all the time. I mean, I know that sounds very dramatic, but on some scale, it is true. I think it's important. But on the other hand, the internet and this digital age has been an incredible asset. I mean, we will never run out of news as long as there are moms groups on Facebook, local community forums. So it's really been a treasure. I mean, I find gems. I would pitch probably at least 60% of my stories when I set my pitch list every day came from things that I spend an hour in the morning just going through Facebook and the community groups and moms groups. I mean, I never lie, I ask if I can join, and if they let me, I do, so just to be clear. But so there are really two sides of it, right? The internet can be such a great place, but I just think we have to be so careful in this environment when it comes to sharing information and making every part of it as accurate. Even your grammar, right? If you misspell a word, you look like an idiot. You don't want to do that in this age. So those are my 2 cents.
So I'd like to just pitch to you something we're doing at Hofstra with our students there at Long Island Advocate. So it's longislandadvocate.com. I would encourage you to go there and take a look at those stories because these are young journalists. This is the next generation. It's all community-based news, and it's anywhere on Long Island. And it's an exciting project. It's a brand new project, so we're pretty excited about that. So check that out. I would encourage you to check out the Freeport Herald because the editor there is, her name is Nadia Robles. She goes by Nadia Natalie in the paper. It's a community of color. It's a very diverse community, and you should check out her writings on MS-13 and so forth because there's definitely a different side to that argument there. I would just encourage you to check out liherald.com.
And I want to support that. There's actually some terrific weeklies on Long Island. In my past lives, a couple of different other jobs I've had dealings with some of them, and they're great. They're breaking stories. The East End papers, the Herald. I had some dealings with your paper when I was doing some work at Northwell, and they are really, really on top of their community. So I'd encourage you, if you're in their community, to buy a paper. I'm not as optimistic as some people here are about the future of newspapers, only because I've seen so many people I know lose their jobs. So many papers I know have closed. My hometown paper in Ohio had a few years ago 50 people in the newsroom. It now has 13. It's left its building, and it now took over the space in an Arby's. So, that's how diminished it is. So there's this really serious problem. The other thing is, and I think you know this, and we're all used to hearing about the Russian trolls planting in bad information. So are people in your community for the wrong reasons. So we've all just gone through this whole Matinicon, housing complex. There's a political candidate who came onto my site, my page when I was praising the Newsday series a couple weeks ago, and insisted it was a lie. Insisted that he had been tested, which he was a real estate agent. He had not been tested, according to Newsday. Told me he was going to sue Newsday to get his money back for having wasted his time, and is now going around telling everybody that it's low-income Section 8 when it's really affordable housing. So he is actively campaigning, and you know who I'm talking about, actively campaigning to create this false narrative, and I'm starting to see people pick it up. So it's not only on the Trump level or Trump, it's in your own community. I live online, so I'm more reactive to what I see online. So I'm really conscious and see this kind of negativity coming out of the very area that I work in. So that's it.
So first, Jackie, thank you for doing such a fine job moderating.
That's why we like JT the panel.
So I would say, Newsday is only as strong as the community that we serve. And one of the things that we rely so much on is hearing from members of the community. So I'd like to just briefly talk about how can you contact Newsday. You've got a story, you think there's something we should be writing about. And there are 2 ways to do it. First of all, as you know, we have 10 reporters who write about the 10 major towns of Long Island. So if you've got community news and for example, Deborah Morris is one of our Huntington Town reporters. She loves covering the town. She's now back from the series, so she's full-time back at covering Huntington Town. Reach out to her directly. Let's say you're not sure who to reach out to. You're not sure what beat a reporter has, or you're not sure which editor to contact. If you know someone at Newsday, you can contact them. One of our responsibilities as journalists is to get you to the right person. Finally, I would say to you, think about a very old-fashioned form of communication. I get more than 500 email a day. I maybe get 5 or 6 letters in a week. Type a little note to me, fold it 3 ways, put it in an envelope, and put a stamp on it. I'll be honest with you, we read every single postal mail we get because it's so rare. And I'll tell you, when I get those wonderful brown envelopes that are 8.5 by 11, you know it's a tipster. It's someone who's giving you a really interesting piece of information. And a lot of the best stories that I do come from average Long Islanders who want the world to know about something, whether it's good or bad. A few years ago, I did a story about a crooked venture capitalist. Well, it turns out he ticked off one of his investors. And the investor kept calling the state to complain about the problem. The state wouldn't listen to this gentleman, so he reached out to me. I said, hey, why don't we go have a cup of coffee? Turns out this guy had discovered a huge financial scam that embarrassed the administration of Andrew Cuomo. The state closed up the investing program completely and no longer does venture capital investing. All because of one man in Ronkonkoma having faith in Newsday. So we're only as strong as the community that we're a part of. And we really do want to hear from you. But as I said, think about, if it's not a pressing matter, the old-fashioned letter, because you get a lot of attention that way.
So, and I will just add, if you're interested in news, which I guess you are since you are here, I do a weekly online newsletter that if you want to sign up for, you can do it from fairmediacouncil.org, or if you want to give me your card. It's weekly, it's free, you can opt out anytime. I don't sell your information or any of that stuff, so there's no downside to it. And we do events throughout the year where we do connect you with the media, and we talk about, you know, how to actively pitch stories and get your stories placed and things of that sort. The other thing I would say is, for anyone posting anything on social media, I ask you to do 2 things. One, you say you attended the panel with the smartest people and the best looking people. Okay? I will let Eric Alexander sort that out. So thank you all for participating, and thank you all for your